Now we're going to talk about counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That's a situation where government tries to use the budget to keep the economy from going too far in a recession or going too far in a boom, to stabilize the economy. We're going to focus mainly on what's called discretionary counter-cyclical policy. That's where explicit decisions are made to increase government purchases or maybe temporarily cut taxes. And contrast that with the automatic stabilizers that we discussed when we noticed how the budget deficit or surplus moves along with the economy. Automatic stabilizers refers to the fact that government spending can automatically rise in a recession because there's more unemployment payments being made, or taxes can automatically fall in a recession as people lose their jobs. So that counters the tendency for the economy to go down further by reducing taxes and increasing spending automatically. Today, we're not going to focus on the automatic stabilizers, but these discretionary changes where there's specific decisions made to change the law or to take actions. The aim of these actions is to try to increase GDP if it's below potential GDP through the Keynesian multiplier. It wasn't used much in the 80s and 90s, but it's back in recent terms. For example, there was a stimulus package which had these goals in 2008 in the Bush administration, and another stimulus package which had these goals in 2009. It's a very controversial area in economics. Keynes and Hayek debated this in the 30s and 40s, and more recently Friedman and Samuelson have debated these issues, and economists continue to debate these issues today. So let's consider sort of what's going on first, and then consider some of the different kinds of arguments. We can begin with the 45-degree line and the expenditure line. This is sometimes called the Keynesian Cross. The idea here is if the economy is in a recession or below normal, if you increase G, delta G is positive, you shift up the green expenditure line to another point. That brings you to another point of spending balance on the 45-degree line, and you can see GDP increases. There's a delta Y, GDP changes in the positive direction. There's a multiplier effect here because you can see delta Y is larger than delta G. However, there's not necessarily agreement amongst economists about how much larger. In fact, models differ greatly. Sometimes economists find the multiplier as low as 0.5. Sometimes they find it as high as 2. So that's one of the things that makes discretionary fiscal policy difficult. We don't really know the impact precisely of a particular change in, say, government spending on GDP. Let's see how this works in the ADIA model. And so in the top part of the graph, we have a situation where real GDP is below potential GDP. That's where the intersection of the AD and the IA line are. So let's suppose that's the starting point. We're away from potential GDP in a recession. And so now the goal here of discretionary fiscal policy is to increase government purchases, which will shift the AD line to the right, give us a new intersection with the IA line, and thereby bring the economy back to potential GDP. That's what the model tells us, which will happen in this ideal situation. If you're above potential GDP, as in the bottom, you want to slow down the economy, reverse can happen. You can reduce government purchases, and that'll take you to a lower point, closer to potential GDP, and there's a stabilization of the economy in this direction too, getting you closer to potential GDP. The same thing can happen if you change taxes. You could raise taxes or lower taxes. Raising taxes would reduce consumption. Lower taxes would increase consumption. So suppose you're in the upper diagram now with real GDP below potential GDP. In this case, if you have a tax cut, people will spend more. Aggregate demand will shift to the right, and you get to a higher level of GDP equal to potential. So ideally, it looks great. This is how discretionary fiscal policy could work in the case of a tax cut. Or you could go in the other direction. If you're above, this case would be a tax increase, and you bring it back to potential GDP. Temporary tax increases like this are relatively rare, but they do happen. 1968, way back then, there was a temporary tax surcharge to try to slow down the economy because people were worried about inflation at that time. So this is the way this occurs. Now, one thing that's important, as we know from studying macro models, is the dynamics, because we need to worry about what happens over change. This is kind of a static picture that I'm showing right here. So let's consider a situation where we're going into a recession and policymakers must figure out what to do and just see the things that could possibly complicate the picture. So we'll start here, and maybe this is a situation where we're at full employment, potential GDP is equal to real GDP at the intersection of the AD and IA line. Then suppose there's a recession that occurs. The economy goes into a slump, maybe investment falls for some exogenous reason, a panic or a financial crisis. Then we know the story here. You're basically going to move over to the left, first of all, to the intersection of the new red line at the original IA line. And that's going to eventually bring the economy back to normal as the IA line gradually falls over time. Interest rates will fall and the economy comes back to normal. Potential GDP again at the last point in the picture. So again, you're starting off here, you move over to that point to the left, and then you move down to the point here, which is basically back to full employment, or where real GDP equals to potential GDP. So now think about the role of counter-cyclical policy. Suppose there's a tax cut or a spending increase that will move the curve over to the right. Let's assume it's timely, it's done just in time. And so you now have a better path along the diamonds here. It gets you back to potential GDP faster because you've shifted that curve over to the right. So that's kind of a way in which this could be working in practice, offsetting a negative shock with a positive shock. However, so it sometimes happens is this initial burst of, say, tax cuts is only temporary. And it may only affect spending temporarily. So the curve, the new AD curve may shift back to where it was, say for an example. And the arrow showing it, erasing it, moving back to where it was. And now you're going to end up at a situation where in the end you will be at a point which you may either come gradually back or you're basically returned to the original point or close to it, as shown in the picture, the path of the economy with the failed fiscal stimulus, which just only had a temporary effect. So these are the kind of things that can occur in practice, and you can see this a little better visually if you look at potential GDP growing along in this chart with years on the vertical axis, and you see actual GDP represented schematically now in blue, and so that may be situation of a recession without any intervention. So what we'd like to do ideally, if these policies would work, is have a fiscal stimulus and bring us back to potential GDP more quickly, as shown by the blue line that rises rapidly back to potential GDP. But if indeed the countercyclical intervention just has a temporary effect, you maybe see something like this, in which case there's maybe at best a short blip and then you're back to the old path, and even this old path might be slower than you would like. And so this is kind of the complication. Now you might ask, why would it be temporary? What could cause that? Well, it turns out that some of the macroeconomic theories do distinguish between temporary and more permanent actions. One of those theories is called the permanent income model of consumption. It's a somewhat different model of consumption that goes into the 45-degree line. And that's one of the reasons why these actions may be more complicated than you get with the 45-degree line. The idea with the permanent income model of consumption is that people, when they're deciding how much to consume, consider their longer-term income. They're called permanent income. And if it's permanent income is higher, they'll consume more. If it's lower, they'll consume less. The permanent income might depend on your education, what kind of job you have, how many people in a family are working. So it's a longer-term phenomenon. That will determine the consumption. If this is the case and they suddenly get a temporary tax cut or a temporary check is paid trying to stimulate the economy, they might not adjust their consumption. In fact, the theory would say they do not adjust their consumption very much in response to these temporary changes in income that could come from these attempts to stimulate the economy. So another name for this idea is sometimes called the life cycle model, because it stresses a person's income over a longer period of time, almost the life cycle, not just a year or two or a quarter or two or half a year. It's basically over a long period of time. The permanent income version of this model was developed by Milton Friedman. The life cycle version was developed by Franco Modigliani. Both of them won Nobel Prizes largely for this kind of work. So what this implies is that a stimulus package that is temporary, maybe a temporary tax cut, is going to have a smaller effect on consumption. And so let's look at some examples. This is an example that I've tended to focus on because it captures some of the ideas. It's not a perfect example, but it's a good one. In this case, we're going to look at what happens to consumption, labeled in the green line, by personal consumption expenditures. That's the formal term for it. And we're also looking at how much people have to spend on consumption. That's going to be called disposable personal income. It's called disposable because we're taking the taxes out already. It's what people have left over after they pay their taxes, what's disposable to spend. On the vertical axis, we show billions of dollars for the economy as a whole. And then we show the growth here going into 2008 when there was a stimulus package passed in the latter days of the George W. Bush administration. And you can see it quite clearly. It raised people's incomes dramatically by the red line there. Those are these temporary payments meant to stimulate the economy. The blue line represents what would have happened without the stimulus, so you can see the effect of the stimulus. And this was supposed to affect consumption, but as you see, consumption just seemed to go on its merry way. It wasn't anywhere near a blip like you see with the change in income. And moreover, at this point, the economy did go into a recession, so consumption fell, and it's more visible than ever that you see little impact on consumption from this stimulus. In 2009, there was another stimulus, and that's represented by the blip here. That was the first part of the Obama administration. It had very little effect on consumption. The only effect on consumption shown here was due to another program where people were giving some cash to exchange their clunker cars, gas-guzzling cars, for some new cars in an attempt to stimulate automobile production. It had a little bit of an effect there, but it diminished over time. So the basic argument here is that these things don't seem to have a big effect. The counter to this, and this is why it's such a contentious topic of discussion for economists, is other things might have happened. Maybe consumption would have fallen without this stimulus. We don't know for sure. Some of the arguments are difficult to prove one way or the other. This is a blown-up picture of what happened with the cash for clunkers, and you can see it did have a small impact relative to the overall economy, but very short-lived. It didn't really help the economy for very long, and moreover, it kind of reversed afterwards. The red line shows you how much personal consumption expenditure it was with the cash for clunkers, and the blue line is what it would have been by our best estimates without cash for clunkers. And you can see the red's a little higher than the blue early on, but then reverses later. So mainly a bringing forward of spending for a while from the future, but by a relatively small amount. So these are some of the differences of opinion. Now, if you go back to the beginning of the last recession in 2007, 2008, and look what happened, and here's a picture of that. You see real GDP fell below potential GDP, that's the recession. And then the idea was to have a stimulus package to get the economy moving again. And we talked about the stimulus package both in 2008 and 2009. So the hope was basically to get back to full employment, to potential GDP faster with the stimulus and without the stimulus. That was the argument that was made. The hope was that an increase in government purchases or a temporary cut in taxes would get us back to potential GDP faster. But unfortunately, neither of those happened, and the economy remained sluggish. The stimulus packages didn't seem to add to growth. If anything, it continued at a lower level, and the gap between potential and actual GDP was not closed. Some people argue that if you hadn't had the stimulus package, things would have been worse, and that could be represented here. Maybe without the stimulus, things would have been worse. We'll never know for sure. Some people would say that's not too plausible. What could possibly bring the economy down further? But economists will debate that. And so they would say the stimulus helped keep us on the red line rather than going down on the green line. The other view, which is it really didn't work, shows you what happens with the stimulus and without the stimulus. And these are people who feel that the permanent income model was quite accurate, multipliers are small, all the things that would make the stimulus packages less effective come into play in this argument. So that's the nature of the debate. You can see some of the reasons for the debate. The simple models may suggest that these things work, but even they're uncertain about the size of the multiplier. When you bring in more sophisticated reasoning, like the permanent income model or the life cycle model, you'll see things become more questionable. I want to conclude this discussion with a very famous chart, which was originally constructed in January 2009 by Christina Romer, who was the chief of the President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and Jared Bernstein, who was the economic advisor to the vice president at that time. So they drew this picture in early 2009, January 2009. This is a picture of the unemployment rate. A vertical axis shows you the percent, and you see the timing here of the period around the recession. So unemployment was rising. They drew this diagram at about the point where the light blue line and the dark blue line separate. And the argument was that with the stimulus package, called a recovery plan in this picture, unemployment would have peaked at around 8%, as you can see, and then started to come down. The argument was if you did not have the recovery plan, did not have the stimulus package, unemployment would be higher on the lighter shaded line. In fact, unemployment was higher than either of these pictures, shown by the red dots in the picture. That's what the actual unemployment was, getting to 10%. And so many people look at this and say, well, clearly the recovery plan didn't work. Unemployment was higher than you said it would be. It was even higher than you claimed it would be without the recovery plan, without the stimulus package. The counter to that argument, the argument that it did make a difference, was that things would have been worse without this, that unemployment could have been 12, 13, 14% without the stimulus package. Because the stimulus package, it was only at the red points, represented by a maximum of around 10%. So that argument is based on the fact that things got worse during 2009 than the economists thought it would be based in January. As you can see, it's hard to prove, and there's debate back and forth. Economists will be working on this for a while to try to decide what really happened. I think what's important for a student of economics is to really understand the reasons for these differences. We've given some of the reasons by differences of opinion about models, differences of opinion about what kind of policy works, different of opinions about theory, and different empirical estimates. Macroeconomics is by nature a part of economics which it's hard to experiment, it's hard to rerun a recession, it's hard to do another plan, and so the arguments will probably persist for a while, just as they persisted for years. If you think going back, you had the Keynes and Hayek arguments, the Friedman-Samuelson arguments, and you're having the same kind of arguments today. Thank you very much.